Brian Stokes had never intended to find himself embroiled in a fight over an old, neglected plot of land. His world was centered on logistics, contracts, numbers, and schedules. He ran a modest but successful land leasing agency, specializing in renting industrial and commercial parcels to transportation companies and storage operators. The business was stable, predictable, and very far from the kinds of neighborhood politics and social entanglements he typically avoided. But, as fate would have it, a curious opportunity had landed on his desk 6 months ago, one that he initially saw as little more than an interesting side project with potential for decent returns. The property in question was a parcel on the edge of a well-to-do suburban neighborhood known as Willowbrook Estates, an area with manicured lawns, private drives, and the kind of community committees that hosted wine tastings and historical home tours. The land itself was an anomaly, a forgotten remnant of a larger estate that had been broken up decades ago when the area was developed. An aging, weather-worn pavilion still stood at the center of the lot, surrounded by unkempt grass and bordered by towering oaks that seemed determined to reclaim the space. The previous owner had passed away in debt, leaving the parcel tangled in probate and tax complications for years. When the county finally cleared the title and put it up for auction, Brian had noticed. He attended the auction out of curiosity, not fully expecting to bid. But as the property drew little attention, likely due to its complicated history, he saw an opportunity. For a fraction of its appraised value, Brian became the new owner. His plan was straightforward: secure the necessary permits, clear the lot, demolish the unsafe pavilion, and prepare the parcel for future commercial leasing. The location was strategic, close to a new bypass and several distribution hubs. It was the kind of property he knew how to handle. After finalizing the purchase, Brian took all the proper steps. He filed the ownership transfer with the county recorder, commissioned a structural assessment of the pavilion which unsurprisingly declared it unsound and hazardous, and submitted an application to the city's Building and Safety Department for demolition approval. The city required a 10-day notice before active demolition could begin, a routine process Brian had dealt with many times. He also sent formal written notice to the Willowbrook Neighborhood Council, commonly referred to as the Council, a voluntary association that oversaw certain community matters, organized events, and occasionally lobbied the city on behalf of residents. Though the property was not part of the council's membership, it was physically within the neighborhood boundaries, and Brian preferred to err on the side of transparency. He received no response. Not unusual. He assumed the matter was settled. Life went on. In the following weeks, Brian focused on other projects. The demolition permit was scheduled to be finalized the following month, and he intended to oversee the process personally to ensure everything remained compliant. It was a simple piece of business, or so he thought. That illusion shattered one crisp morning in early spring. The first email came from an unfamiliar sender, a message that struck him as oddly cheerful. The subject line read, "Thank you for your support. Willowbrook Community Wedding." Puzzled, Brian opened the email and began reading. "Dear Mr. Stokes, we would like to extend our sincerest gratitude for your generosity in supporting our upcoming community wedding event. The use of the Willowbrook Pavilion for the wedding of Emily Harris and Jonathan Barnes is deeply appreciated by both families and by the council. Setup for the event will commence this week, with the ceremony scheduled for Saturday. We look forward to seeing you there." Brian blinked at the screen. His first reaction was that the message had been sent in error. He read it again, slower. There was no mistake. The email was addressed to him, cited his ownership of the land, and referred to the pavilion by name. The casual tone of assumption was infuriating. He had authorized no such use of the property, had signed no rental agreement, and had certainly not agreed to host what, from the sound of it, would be a large-scale social event. His annoyance deepened as he scrolled to the bottom of the message and saw an attached PDF labeled Event Logistics. The file was a full-blown event plan: guest lists, vendor contacts, a timeline for setup and breakdown, and detailed diagrams of the pavilion and surrounding grounds, complete with tent placements, catering stations, portable restroom locations, and even valet parking zones. The brazenness of it stunned him. Less than an hour later, Brian was in his truck, heading toward the property. His office manager, seeing the rare flash of anger in her typically even-tempered boss, had wisely chosen not to ask questions. As he drove through Willowbrook's narrow, winding streets, Brian considered the possibilities. Perhaps someone had made an innocent mistake. Perhaps the council had failed to update their records and assumed the land was still under community access. But as he turned onto the gravel drive leading to his parcel, those faint hopes evaporated. The scene that greeted him was surreal. Several trucks and utility vans were already on site. Workers bustled around the pavilion, unloading equipment, rolling out temporary flooring, and erecting scaffolding for lighting rigs. White folding chairs were stacked in neat rows beside a cluster of canvas tents. A portable generator hummed in the background. The transformation was already well underway. Brian parked off to the side and approached a man in a collared shirt who appeared to be coordinating the activity. "Excuse me," Brian said evenly. "Who's in charge here?" The man glanced up, clipboard in hand. "Good morning. You must be Mr. Stokes. I'm Kevin Marks, the event planner for the Harris Barnes wedding." He extended a hand. Brian didn't take it. "I didn't approve this event," he said. "You're trespassing on private property." Kevin's smile faltered slightly but remained in place. "Oh, I think there's been some confusion," he said smoothly. "We've been working with the council for months. They provided authorization. All the paperwork was filed through them." "Paperwork?" Brian echoed. "With whom? I own this land. There is no valid lease, no contract, and no permission from me." Kevin's professional demeanor wavered now. He glanced around as if searching for backup. "Look, I'm just following the plan we were given," he said. "We've got a full schedule this week. The wedding is Saturday. Guests are flying in. Vendors are contracted. If there's an issue, you should really speak to the council directly." "Trust me," Brian said coldly. "I will." Without another word, he turned on his heel and marched back to his truck. The drive to his office felt surreal. His mind raced through scenarios, each more maddening than the last. He was well aware that stopping the event now would involve more than a few stern phone calls. Given the size and profile of the families involved, he recognized both names from local business circles. This was a carefully orchestrated affair, not some casual gathering. Someone had engineered this situation under the assumption that Brian would either not notice in time or, more likely, would simply cave to social pressure and allow it to proceed. But they had badly misjudged him. By the time Brian reached his office, he had already called his attorney and briefed him on the situation. "Document everything," the attorney advised immediately. "Photographs, video, timestamps. Don't interfere with the workers physically. Submit a formal cease and desist to the council today. And do not, under any circumstances, let them pressure you into verbal agreements. Keep everything in writing." Brian nodded grimly. "I'll handle it." That afternoon, with a professional photographer in tow, Brian returned to the property and meticulously documented every detail of the unauthorized activity. He filed the cease and desist with both the council and the city clerk, formally asserting his property rights and objecting to the event. As the sun dipped behind the oaks, casting long shadows across the grounds, Brian stood by the pavilion and stared at the flurry of activity. The arrogance of it burned in his gut. They thought they could steamroll him. They thought he would fold under the weight of local influence. They were wrong. The pavilion had been marked for demolition. The paperwork was in order. The timeline was clear. And as of that moment, Brian resolved that by the time the wedding guests arrived, there would be nothing left to host them. By the following morning, Brian's office phone had already rung twice with politely veiled inquiries. First came a call from a woman identifying herself as Meredith Clark, the chair of the Willowbrook Neighborhood Council. Her tone was practiced, warm, and laden with a carefully measured civility that only sharpened Brian's suspicion. After the briefest of pleasantries, she launched into a scripted reassurance. "I understand there's been a bit of a misunderstanding regarding this weekend's event," she said smoothly. "Of course, we fully respect your ownership of the property. It's simply that for many years the pavilion has served as a de facto community space, and I'm afraid some assumptions were made based on long-standing traditions. It was never our intention to cause you inconvenience." Brian, who had listened silently up to that point, interrupted without ceremony. "Let's be clear. There is no misunderstanding on my part. The land is private. I have issued no authorization for its use. The structures being erected there constitute trespass." There was a beat of pause. Then Meredith continued in the same polished tone, though the faintest edge had crept in. "I do understand, Mr. Stokes, but surely, given the special nature of this event and the families involved, we can arrive at a mutually agreeable solution. The Harris and Barnes families have invested considerable effort and resources, and many distinguished guests are expected. It would be regrettable to disrupt such an important occasion over a mere technicality." Brian's jaw tightened. "It's not a technicality. It's the law." Another pause, this one heavier. "Perhaps we might continue this discussion over lunch today," she suggested. Brian declined curtly and ended the call. Minutes later, another call came in, this time from a man representing the Harris family. His tone was less refined, more transactional. The message, however, was the same. Could an arrangement be reached, preferably financial, to allow the wedding to proceed unimpeded? Brian's response was brief and unequivocal. No agreement, no negotiation. The property was not for rent, and unauthorized occupation would not be tolerated. That afternoon, Brian and his attorney met to review the situation. The legal options were clear but fraught with procedural delays. An emergency injunction could be filed, but it might not be heard before the weekend. A police report could be made, but enforcement in civil property matters was notoriously inconsistent, especially when local politics were involved. The most effective path remained the one Brian had already prepared: proceed with the scheduled demolition under full compliance with municipal codes. The demolition permit was days from activation. Once valid, it would legally supersede any unauthorized use of the site. Timing was critical. Brian requested the permit's expedited confirmation, citing the pavilion's hazardous condition. He also scheduled the demolition team to be on standby, ready to mobilize the moment clearance was granted. Meanwhile, activity at the site continued at a frenetic pace. Each time Brian visited to document progress, he found new elements added: floral arrangements, stages, even a temporary dance floor under construction. Security personnel in matching blazers now hovered at the edges of the lot, eyeing him with guarded expressions. Clearly, the council and the event organizers were betting on momentum and social pressure to force his compliance. Yet, behind the scenes, a different layer of resistance was emerging. Brian's attorney discovered that the so-called tradition of community use was not enshrined in any binding agreement. The pavilion had once been accessible under a now-defunct easement that expired with the previous owner's passing and had not transferred with the sale. The council's reliance on custom rather than contract left them legally vulnerable. Nevertheless, the wedding's political gravity complicated matters. The Harris family, long entrenched in local business circles, wielded substantial influence. Rumors swirled of calls being placed to city officials, subtle attempts to delay Brian's demolition permit, or otherwise interfere with his legal standing. That Thursday, the day before the permit's expected clearance, Brian received an unmarked envelope at his office. Inside was a handwritten note, unsigned. "Think carefully before you escalate this further. The council can be your friend, or your problem." The veiled threat only strengthened his resolve. He reported the incident to his attorney and instructed his staff to log all further communications. Later that evening, an anonymous tip reached Brian's attorney through a colleague in city administration. Pressure was indeed being applied to stall the permit, ostensibly under the guise of additional community impact review. It was an old game, bureaucratic friction used to exhaust opposition. But Brian was prepared. Early Friday morning, he and his attorney personally visited the Building and Safety Department with a full dossier of the pavilion's inspection reports, structural assessments, and photographic evidence of its deteriorated state. The department director, a seasoned civil servant with little patience for political theater, reviewed the file and signed off on the demolition clearance. The permit was officially validated at noon. Word spread quickly. Within hours, Brian received another call, this time from an attorney representing the Barnes family. The tone was sharper now, legalistic. The message, any attempt to demolish the pavilion before the wedding would result in immediate civil litigation and substantial claims for damages. Brian forwarded the communication to his attorney, who drafted a formal response reiterating Brian's rights as property owner and the lawful basis for the demolition. That evening, Brian visited the site once more. The wedding setup was nearly complete. Rows of chairs gleamed under strings of decorative lights. A catering crew bustled near the service tents. Security staff now manned a visible perimeter. It was a spectacle of entitlement, an assumption of control over what was not theirs. Brian stood alone by the property line, taking it all in. There was no sense in arguing further. The path forward was set. Early the next morning, the demolition crew would arrive. The pavilion's fate would be sealed. Let them threaten. Let them bluster. The law was on his side, and this time they would learn that not every opponent could be cowed by social clout and whispered promises. Brian turned back toward his truck, a cold determination settling over him. Tomorrow would not be the day they expected. Brian awoke before dawn on Saturday, his mind already focused on the day ahead. The demolition crew was scheduled to arrive by 7, and he intended to be on site before them to ensure no unexpected obstacles emerged overnight. There had been too many signals in the past few days that certain parties were willing to bend rules to preserve their event plans, and Brian was not about to leave anything to chance. He dressed quickly, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and drove through the quiet streets of Willowbrook, the early morning sky still heavy with pre-dawn haze. As he approached the property, a grim satisfaction flickered through him. This was not the path he would have chosen under normal circumstances. He had no personal vendetta against the Harris or Barnes families, nor against the council. But they had forced his hand with their arrogance, their presumption that his land was theirs to appropriate simply because of tradition and influence. And now they would face the consequences of that miscalculation. The first sign of trouble appeared as he turned onto the access road leading to his lot. 2 dark SUVs were parked across the entry point, blocking the path. A uniformed private security guard stood nearby, arms folded. Brian pulled up alongside and rolled down his window. "You're blocking access to private property," he said evenly. The guard gave a practiced smile. "Morning, sir. We've been instructed to restrict site access to authorized personnel only. Wedding vendors and council-approved staff." Brian's jaw tightened. "I am the property owner. I have a valid demolition permit. Move the vehicles, or I'll have them towed." The guard's smile thinned. "I'm going to need to call my supervisor." "You have 2 minutes," Brian replied coldly, then dialed his attorney. As the call connected, he detailed the situation. "Document it," the attorney advised. "Photograph the blockage. Call the police to report unlawful obstruction. I'll notify the city's legal office immediately." Brian exited his truck, phone still in hand, and began snapping photos. Clear images of the SUVs, the security personnel, and the blocked road. The guard, now looking less certain, spoke hurriedly into his radio. Moments later, another black sedan arrived, from which a sharply dressed woman emerged, Meredith Clark. She approached with a diplomatic air, though her eyes betrayed a certain steeliness. "Mr. Stokes," she greeted, "there's no need for this unpleasantness. Surely we can find a reasonable accommodation." Brian fixed her with a cold stare. "You're obstructing lawful activity on my property. The demolition is proceeding as scheduled. Move your vehicles now." Meredith's voice lowered, her tone more intimate. "Brian, be sensible. The Harris and Barnes families are prepared to be very generous to avoid an incident today. A settlement could be reached that would benefit everyone." Brian's patience snapped. "You don't seem to understand. This isn't about money. This is about ownership, about the rule of law. You have no right to be here, and no amount of backroom offers will change that." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and dialed the local police non-emergency line, calmly reporting the obstruction. As he spoke, another vehicle approached, this time the demolition contractor's truck. The foreman, a stocky, no-nonsense man named Jorge Martinez, climbed out and surveyed the scene. "Problem?" he asked. "Temporary," Brian replied. "Proceed with equipment staging. Police are on their way." Jorge nodded, signaling to his crew. They began unloading equipment along the shoulder of the road, outside the blocked entry. The message was clear. They were ready to proceed the moment the path was cleared. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car arrived, lights flashing. The responding officer, a young but professional sergeant, listened carefully as Brian explained the situation, showing him the property deeds, the demolition permit, and photos of the obstruction. Meredith attempted to interject, but the officer cut her off politely but firmly. "Ma'am, unless you have legal authority to restrict access to this property, you'll need to remove these vehicles." A tense negotiation followed, but ultimately, faced with the threat of police action and the undeniable legitimacy of Brian's position, Meredith relented. The SUVs were reluctantly moved aside. Brian thanked the officer and waved Jorge's crew forward. By 7:30, the demolition team was on site and operational. The heavy equipment rumbled to life, and the first blows against the aging pavilion structure began. The sound of splintering wood and groaning metal echoed through the cool morning air. Word of the unfolding event spread quickly. By 8, a procession of high-end cars began arriving. Members of the Harris and Barnes entourages, visibly alarmed by the sight of the pavilion's destruction. Lawyers and family representatives demanded explanations, some attempting to physically enter the work zone, only to be turned away by the demolition crew's own security detail, which Brian had prudently hired in advance. The confrontation reached a new level when a silver Mercedes pulled up, and a tall, imposing man emerged. Robert Harris himself, patriarch of the Harris family and a figure of considerable local clout. He strode directly to Brian, flanked by 2 attorneys. "Mr. Stokes," he began, voice low and controlled, "you are making a grave mistake. Do you have any idea the consequences of this action?" Brian met his gaze without flinching. "I am enforcing my property rights, Mr. Harris. The only mistake here was assuming I wouldn't." One of Harris's lawyers stepped forward, waving a thick folder. "We are filing an emergency injunction as we speak. If you proceed, you will face substantial legal exposure." Brian's attorney, who had now arrived on site, countered smoothly. "Your injunction, assuming it's even granted, will not retroactively prohibit a legally permitted demolition already in progress. You are welcome to pursue damages after the fact, but today's operations are fully compliant with city and state law." The exchange drew a small crowd. Vendors, staff, even a few early arriving guests now stood awkwardly at the perimeter, watching the legal drama unfold amid the roar of machinery. Brian ignored them. His focus remained on the work, which progressed with deliberate efficiency. By mid-morning, the pavilion was reduced to rubble. Crews began clearing debris, ensuring no trace of the structure remained. It was a calculated move. By eliminating the physical venue, Brian left no avenue for last-minute compromises or occupation. The property, now an active demolition site, was legally unsuitable for public gathering. The wedding was, for all practical purposes, canceled. As noon approached, tempers flared anew. Meredith reappeared, this time accompanied by 2 city council members attempting a last-ditch appeal. "Brian," one councilman urged, "surely there's still a way to resolve this amicably. The community will remember today's events for a long time. Brian's reply was icy. Then let them remember who stood for the rule of law when others tried to trample it. The message was unmistakable. There would be no reversal, no apology, no compromise. The demolition continued until late afternoon, the once grand pavilion reduced to an empty lot. Exhausted but resolute, Brian surveyed the cleared ground as the last of the equipment was loaded for departure. The battle had been won, but he knew the war was not yet over. Legal reprisals would follow, political retaliation was likely. But for now, the message was clear. His land was not for others to claim, no matter how powerful or entitled they believed themselves to be. The following days were anything but quiet. Brian returned to his office Sunday morning, already anticipating the storm of legal and public relations fallout that was bound to follow Saturday's dramatic events. He was not wrong. By the time he arrived, a stack of emails and voicemails awaited him, ranging from formal legal notices to vaguely threatening personal messages. The most prominent among them was a formal notice of intent to sue, delivered electronically by the Harris family's legal team late Saturday evening and physically couriered to his office first thing Sunday morning. The document was dense, filled with familiar legal rhetoric accusing Brian of malicious interference, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and financial damages stemming from the abrupt cancellation of the wedding. The claim demanded a staggering sum, undoubtedly inflated for shock value. Brian was unsurprised. His attorney, who reviewed the document with clinical detachment, advised immediate preparation for what was certain to become a prolonged legal battle. Yet, for all the bluster, Brian remained confident in the strength of his position. Every step he had taken had been meticulously documented and executed in full compliance with municipal and state regulations. The demolition had been lawful, properly permitted, and justified by the structural condition of the pavilion. The opposition's primary tactic now was intimidation, an effort to exhaust him financially and psychologically. Brian was prepared for that. What he had not anticipated, however, was the extent to which the council and its allies would escalate their campaign. By Monday, subtle pressures began to emerge in other areas of his business. 2 long-standing commercial clients reached out discreetly, conveying concern over political noise surrounding Brian's name. A permit renewal for another property he owned in a neighboring district was suddenly delayed without clear explanation. Inquiries to city offices revealed an unusual level of scrutiny now being applied to his projects. It was classic backroom maneuvering, silent, difficult to prove, but undeniably deliberate. Worse still, whispers circulated that members of the council were preparing to introduce new community guidelines aimed at restricting certain types of property usage, guidelines that could, if passed, complicate Brian's ability to lease or develop the Willowbrook parcel in the future. The battle had moved from overt confrontation to systemic harassment. Recognizing the shift, Brian adjusted his strategy accordingly. Rather than responding emotionally or retaliating in kind, he deepened his alliance with legal counsel and began assembling a broader network of support. He reached out to professional contacts, real estate attorneys, civil rights advocates, and seasoned municipal consultants, quietly building a team capable of countering the council's influence. It was during this process that an unexpected source of information emerged. One evening, as Brian was meeting with his attorney, he received an anonymous email from a private address. The message was brief but intriguing. You should know that the Harris wedding wasn't the first. The council has been quietly profiting from similar traditions for years. If you're interested in the truth, we should talk. Attached was a single scanned document, an internal council memo referencing past community partnerships involving various private properties. The implications were significant. Until now, Brian had assumed the wedding incident was an isolated abuse of power, fueled by the prominence of the Harris and Barnes families. This message suggested a deeper, systemic pattern, one that, if exposed, could shift public perception and legal leverage decisively in his favor. Following cautious protocol, Brian's attorney advised setting up a secure off-record meeting to verify the source. 2 days later, in a discreet location, Brian met with the anonymous contact, a junior staff member from the council's administrative office, visibly nervous but determined. Over the course of an hour, the contact confirmed what Brian had begun to suspect. For nearly a decade, select members of the council had orchestrated a lucrative but off-the-books operation, leasing private properties under the guise of community events. In many cases, outdated or defunct easements were exploited, as they had attempted with Brian's pavilion. Families like the Harrises benefited from these arrangements, enjoying prestigious venues without formal contracts or market-rate costs, while certain council members collected under-the-table facilitation fees. The wedding incident had simply brought this shadow operation into an unusually bright spotlight thanks to Brian's refusal to yield. Armed with this new intelligence, Brian's legal team recalibrated its approach. Rather than limiting their defense to the immediate lawsuit, they began preparing a broader counteroffensive aimed at systemic exposure. Carefully curated evidence was compiled, financial irregularities, unauthorized uses of property, and patterns of coercion, all to be presented when the time was right, not only in court but potentially to regulatory and law enforcement authorities. The stakes had grown. What began as a personal defense of property rights had now evolved into a battle against institutional corruption. And though the road ahead promised to be long and fraught with challenge, Brian understood that retreat was no longer an option. The integrity of his business, his reputation, and the broader principle of lawful ownership now hung in the balance. The following weeks saw the conflict escalate beyond anything Brian had originally anticipated. If the initial flurry of legal threats and social posturing had been meant to intimidate or wear him down, it quickly became clear that the council and its powerful allies were prepared to go much further in pursuit of their objectives. The lawsuit filed by the Harris and Barnes families proceeded, but that was merely one front in an increasingly complex battle. More troubling were the mounting signs of coordinated institutional pressure. Brian began to notice a pattern of unusual delays and obstructions across multiple aspects of his business. Permit applications that had previously moved smoothly through municipal channels were now inexplicably held up. Routine inspections were suddenly failing on dubious technicalities, necessitating costly re-inspections and revisions. Banking partners discreetly signaled unease over the ongoing public dispute, hinting at potential reassessments of credit terms. Long-standing commercial clients began to express concerns about continued association, not because of any doubts about Brian's conduct, but because of the pervasive undercurrent of political and social influence now swirling around the situation. Behind these visible manifestations of resistance lay the unseen but palpable hand of the council and its network of sympathizers, an old guard coalition that had long exercised quiet control over local governance and commerce. The strategy was simple: isolate and marginalize Brian until he capitulated or was forced to withdraw from the community altogether. Brian, however, refused to play the role they had written for him. Rather than reacting impulsively or resorting to counter-aggression, he leaned harder into legal strategy and public transparency. His attorneys expanded their investigation into the council's historical practices, uncovering a trove of irregularities that extended well beyond the scope of the wedding incident. Tax filings, property records, and financial disclosures revealed a pattern of opaque transactions and conflicts of interest spanning years. Parallel to the legal work, Brian's public relations consultant began crafting a carefully measured narrative, one that positioned Brian not as an aggressor or troublemaker, but as a principled defender of property rights and lawful governance. The message resonated, particularly among a growing segment of residents disillusioned with the council's long-standing culture of entitlement and backroom dealings. Quiet support began to materialize from unexpected quarters. Business owners, property investors, and even a few retired officials who had long chafed under the council's dominance. Still, the opposition did not relent. In a particularly bold move, The council introduced a new set of proposed community guidelines aimed explicitly at restricting the types of commercial activity permissible within Willowbrook's boundaries. Though couched in the language of preserving neighborhood character, the provisions were transparently designed to impede Bryan's future development plans for the cleared pavilion site. The proposed rules would require onerous special approvals for any use beyond passive green space, a direct assault on the economic viability of Bryan's investment. Recognizing the threat, Bryan mobilized his legal and consulting teams to challenge the guidelines both procedurally and substantively. Public hearings were attended en masse by Bryan's growing base of quiet supporters, who voiced opposition to the council's overreach. Media interest, initially muted, began to stir as reporters caught wind of the deeper corruption narrative now emerging. A particularly damning article in a regional business journal detailed the council's history of self-dealing and opaque financial practices, lending new legitimacy to Bryan's cause. The council's response was swift and calculated. Anonymous complaints were filed with regulatory agencies concerning supposed environmental violations on several of Bryan's properties. Though ultimately unfounded, the investigations consumed valuable time and resources. A coordinated social media campaign sought to paint Bryan as a disruptive outsider bent on eroding community values. Personal attacks intensified. Anonymous letters sent to clients and business partners, smear campaigns aimed at tarnishing his professional reputation. Through it all, Bryan maintained a disciplined focus. He refused to be baited into reactive missteps. Each new provocation was documented, analyzed, and met with proportionate legal or procedural response. His resolve was fortified not only by personal principle but by the growing awareness that this battle transcended his individual interests. At stake was a broader question of governance, accountability, and the rightful limits of communal authority. The turning point came when Bryan's attorneys secured testimony from a former council member who had grown disillusioned with the body's practices. In a sworn affidavit, the individual detailed years of informal property deals, under-the-table payments, and coercive tactics employed against dissenting property owners. The testimony, combined with documentary evidence already amassed, formed the backbone of a comprehensive legal and regulatory complaint now prepared for submission to state oversight bodies. Word of the impending action spread rapidly, further eroding the council's internal cohesion. Behind closed doors, fractures began to appear. Some members, fearing personal exposure or legal jeopardy, began distancing themselves from the leadership's hardline stance. Quiet overtures reached Bryan's legal team, signaling a willingness among certain factions to negotiate a broader settlement and institutional reform. Yet the core leadership, including Meredith Clark, remained defiant. In a dramatic gesture, they pushed forward with a vote on the contested community guidelines, seeking to codify their restrictive vision before the external investigations could fully take hold. The public hearing was tense, attended by a large and unusually diverse crowd. Residents who had rarely engaged in local politics now stood alongside seasoned activists, all galvanized by the council's overreach and Bryan's principled stand. When the vote was called, the result was narrower than expected, an undeniable sign of shifting tides within the community. Though the guidelines passed by a slim margin, the legal foundation for their enforcement was already crumbling under the weight of mounting scrutiny and impending external review. In the aftermath of the vote, Bryan convened with his legal and strategic team to chart the next phase. The immediate priority was to finalize and submit the regulatory complaint, ensuring that state authorities would be compelled to investigate the council's practices in full. Parallel litigation aimed at invalidating the newly passed guidelines was also initiated, grounded in procedural violations and constitutional property rights. As the battle entered this new phase, Bryan remained acutely aware of the stakes. The opposition was wounded but dangerous, capable of further mischief even as their grip weakened. Vigilance, discipline, and unwavering adherence to lawful process would remain his guiding principles. What had begun as a localized dispute over a single parcel of land had now become a defining test of civic integrity. a struggle not just for one man's rights, but for the rightful balance between private ownership and communal governance in a democratic society. As summer turned to fall, the conflict between Bryan and the council reached its inevitable breaking point. The strain was visible not just in legal documents and procedural motions, but in the very fabric of Willowbrook itself. Once placid neighborhood gatherings now simmered with unspoken tensions. Longtime residents found themselves choosing sides, some out of loyalty, others out of principle, and a growing few out of sheer exhaustion with the drama that had unfolded so publicly. For Bryan, the stakes had crystallized beyond mere personal interest. The campaign of harassment, the blatant manipulation of public process, the attempted theft of his property rights, these were affronts that demanded accountability. His legal team, fortified by new alliances with state-level oversight bodies and bolstered by the testimony of the former council member, was now preparing for a decisive round of action. The formal regulatory complaint had been filed with the state's Office of Community Affairs, triggering a preliminary investigation. Simultaneously, a civil suit targeting the enforcement of the newly passed restrictive guidelines was progressing toward its first hearing. Yet amid this carefully managed legal offensive, Bryan knew that the council, particularly its embattled leadership, would not retreat quietly. His expectation proved correct one crisp morning in October when his attorney forwarded an urgent email flagged by a court clerk. The Harrison Barnes legal teams, in conjunction with certain council members, had filed an emergency motion seeking an injunction not only against Bryan's current use of the cleared pavilion site, but against any future development on the grounds. The motion was accompanied by a barrage of last-minute affidavits, many from dubious sources, alleging that Bryan's activities were destabilizing community harmony and presenting undefined risks to neighborhood welfare. The tactic was transparent: overwhelm the court with noise and emotion in the hopes of securing a preemptive ruling that would freeze the property indefinitely. Bryan and his legal team moved swiftly to counter. An emergency hearing was scheduled, and the days leading up to it were consumed with preparation. Evidence was marshaled, witness lists finalized, and a clear narrative constructed, not merely of Bryan's rightful conduct but of the council's pattern of abuse and coercion. The hearing itself was held in a packed courtroom, attended by residents, media representatives, and a full phalanx of legal counsel from both sides. The tension was palpable. The council's attorneys, visibly under pressure, leaned heavily on emotional appeals, portraying Bryan as an outsider disrupting the community's cherished traditions. They invoked the canceled wedding as a symbol of this supposed harm, though under cross-examination their claims quickly unraveled. Bryan's legal team presented a starkly different picture, one grounded in fact and law. They methodically laid out the history of the property, the lawful nature of the demolition, the procedural violations underpinning the new guidelines, and the broader context of systemic misconduct within the council. The testimony of the former council member proved particularly damning, drawing audible reactions from the courtroom audience. After hours of argument and examination, the presiding judge recessed to deliberate. The room buzzed with speculation as attendees waited for the ruling. When court reconvened later that afternoon, the judge delivered a decisive opinion. The emergency motion for injunction was denied in its entirety. The court affirmed that Bryan's actions had been lawful and that the council's conduct raised serious concerns warranting further scrutiny. Moreover, the judge issued a formal admonishment regarding the misuse of community governance structures for private or political gain, signaling a clear judicial awareness of the deeper issues at play. The ruling sent shockwaves through Willowbrook. Within days, several council members announced sudden resignations, citing personal reasons. Behind the scenes, additional witnesses began approaching Bryan's legal team, offering further insight into the council's long-running practices. The state investigation accelerated, with formal inquiries issued to current and former council officers. The victory in court was a critical turning point, but Bryan remained vigilant. He understood that entrenched power seldom ceded ground without resistance. Quietly, he continued building alliances with reform-minded residents and local business leaders, laying the groundwork for a broader push toward transparency and accountability within the community. And while the legal battles were far from over, one truth had now been firmly established in both the courtroom and the public eye. Brian Stokes was not a man to be bullied, and in Willowbrook the days of unchecked council dominance were drawing to a close. In the weeks that followed the court's ruling, a noticeable shift rippled through Willowbrook. The air of invincibility that had long surrounded the council leadership began to erode, replaced by uncertainty and cautious recalibration. Conversations once held in whispers were now openly exchanged in coffee shops and neighborhood gatherings. The community, once tightly bound by unspoken deference to entrenched power, was waking up to the reality that the old order could, in fact, be challenged and held accountable. For Brian, the aftermath brought both relief and new responsibility. The immediate legal threats had been neutralized, but the deeper work of restoring integrity to the community's governance structures remained. He continued to work closely with his legal team as the state's investigation expanded, now encompassing not only the Willowbrook Council but also overlapping civic organizations and affiliated financial entities. Subpoenas were issued, depositions scheduled, and the steady drip of revelations further undermined the council's remaining authority. Meanwhile, the restrictive guidelines hastily passed in the wake of the pavilion's demolition were now the subject of a separate judicial review. Brian's attorneys, leveraging the procedural violations and constitutional arguments developed during the injunction fight, moved aggressively to have the guidelines invalidated. The case gained traction, drawing amicus briefs from property rights organizations and civil liberties groups, further elevating its profile. At the same time, Brian remained acutely aware of the human dimension of the conflict. Though he had prevailed in court, the events had left scars within the community. Relationships had frayed, trust had been shaken, and many residents found themselves navigating a new and uncertain social landscape. Cognizant of this, Brian took deliberate steps to foster dialogue and promote reconciliation. He declined media invitations that sought to sensationalize the story, choosing instead to engage directly with fellow residents through small gatherings and one-on-one conversations. In these settings, he emphasized not victory or vindication, but the shared interest in building a community grounded in fairness, transparency, and respect for the rule of law. Gradually, this message began to resonate. Residents who had once viewed Brian with suspicion now saw him as a principled advocate for integrity and accountability. Business leaders who had quietly supported him from the sidelines became more vocal, lending their voices to calls for governance reform. Even some former council allies, recognizing the untenability of the status quo, expressed willingness to participate in constructive renewal efforts. Against this backdrop of evolving dynamics, Brian turned his attention back to the future of the cleared pavilion site. With the legal obstacles receding, he resumed planning for its development. Rather than pursuing the originally envisioned commercial project, however, he chose a different path, one shaped by the experiences of the past year. In consultation with local architects and community stakeholders, Brian initiated plans for a multi-use green space incorporating both private and public elements. The design emphasized open access, sustainable landscaping, and flexible event facilities governed by clear, transparent policies. Importantly, management of the site would be structured through an independent trust, insulated from political interference and accountable to both property owners and residents. The proposal garnered widespread support, serving as a tangible symbol of the community's new direction. The council, now operating under interim leadership with several seats vacated, lacked the political capital to oppose the project. Instead, a newly formed Civic Oversight Committee, composed of diverse community representatives, emerged to collaborate on its realization. For Brian, the project embodied more than a development opportunity. It represented a chance to help heal the community and lay a foundation for healthier governance moving forward. As construction began in the spring, the once contentious site transformed into a space of renewal, its scars not erased but repurposed as part of a larger narrative of resilience and reform. Reflecting on the journey, Brian recognized that while the battle had been costly in time, energy, and personal strain, it had also yielded enduring value. Property rights had been affirmed, abuses of power had been exposed, and a pathway for lasting institutional change had been forged. The lessons of Willowbrook would not soon be forgotten, nor would the example set for other communities grappling with similar challenges. In the end, Brian had defended not just a parcel of land, but a principle, one that would continue to shape Willowbrook's future long after the dust of the pavilion's demolition had settled.